Welcome to Life Stories, where we bring you tales of resilience, courage, and the unbreakable human spirit. In today's story, we journey to the quiet town of Clearview, where a 90-year-old veteran, Eleanor Ellie Foster, takes a stand against a ruthless biker gang threatening her community. What begins as an act of defiance grows into a movement that transforms the town forever. It's a story of bravery, unity, and the power of people coming together to protect what matters most. Subscribe to our channel and join us as we dive into this incredible tale of redemption and hope. Let's begin. In the heart of Clearview, Ohio, a town where time seemed to slow and the sun painted every street corner with a golden glow. Life had always been tranquil, but even the most peaceful places are not immune to shadows. And that morning, as Eleanor Ellie Foster pulled her aging Chevrolet into the Clearview Gas and Go, she couldn't have imagined how her day would change or how she would change the town forever. Ellie was the kind of woman who carried her age with dignity. At 90, her posture remained impressively straight, her silver hair carefully pinned back, and her deep-set eyes hinted at stories that most people could only imagine. To anyone who didn't know her, Ellie was just another elderly resident, someone who belonged to the backdrop of Clearview's slow-paced charm. But Ellie had lived a life of action, a life of courage. Decades earlier, she had piloted helicopters in Vietnam, pulling men out of enemy fire, saving lives, and earning medals that now lay tucked away in a box beneath her bed. That morning, as the gas pump clicked into place, Ellie exchanged pleasantries with Jimmy, the cheerful young attendant who had worked there since high school. The gentle rhythm of life in Clearview was still intact. The air smelled faintly of gasoline and morning dew, and the distant hum of a passing car was the only interruption in the quiet. Ellie's thoughts drifted to the monthly meeting at the Veterans Hall, a gathering she cherished as a bridge to her past. The rumble of approaching motorcycles shattered the stillness. It began as a faint growl in the distance, growing louder and heavier until the sound seemed to swallow the air itself. Ellie turned slightly, her reflection in the car window revealing a procession of bikers rolling into the lot. Their chrome glinted harshly in the sunlight, their jackets bearing the insignia of the Thunder Riders, a name synonymous with trouble in Clearview. The leader dismounted first, his movements deliberate and predatory. He was known as Havoc, a name that matched the glint in his cold, unfeeling eyes. Behind him, a dozen men spread out, their presence unnerving, their laughter tinged with mockery. Ellie remained at the pump, her hand steady, her face neutral. Years of military training kicked in. Assess the threat. Stay calm. Maintain composure. Well, what do we have here? Havoc's voice carried a sneer as he sauntered toward her. Grandma out for her morning drive. Laughter rippled through the group, but Ellie didn't flinch. She replaced the nozzle and closed her gas cap before turning to face him. Her voice was calm, steady, and unyielding. Just getting gas. No need for trouble. Trouble, of course, was what they thrived on. One of the bikers, a wiry man with a scraggly beard, noticed the license plate frame on her car. Hey, Havoc, check this out. Vietnam veteran. The old lady thinks she's a hero. The laughter turned sharper, crueler. Havoc stepped closer, his expression twisting into a mockery of amusement. A woman veteran? What'd you do in Nam? Sweetheart. Serve coffee. Ellie's hand tightened slightly at her side, but her face betrayed nothing. They couldn't know the weight she carried, the nights spent navigating enemy fire, the faces of the soldiers she'd saved, and the ones she couldn't. Her reply was quiet but firm. I served my country. Served your country? Havoc mimicked her voice, his tone dripping with sarcasm. The only thing you served was dinner. As the gang encircled her, their laughter echoing off the gas station walls, Ellie's sharp eyes caught the faintest hint of fear in young Jimmy's expression through the station window. He had disappeared behind the counter, likely reaching for the phone. She knew the police wouldn't arrive in time, but she also knew she didn't need them, not yet. Young man, she said, her gaze locking with Havoc's. I've faced things that would make your little gang run crying home to Mama. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have a meeting to attend. She reached for her car door, but before she could open it, another biker slammed it shut. The noise startling in the quiet morning. The circle around her tightened. Ellie's heart rate didn't falter, she'd faced worse. Her calm demeanor only seemed to stoke Havoc's anger. You're in our town now, old lady, Havoc growled, his voice low and menacing. We own Clearview. It's time you learned to show some respect. Ellie straightened her back, her voice steady as steel. Respect is earned, son. And so far, all I see are boys playing at being men. For a moment, the only sound was the low, menacing rumble of idling engines. Havoc's face contorted with rage, and he grabbed Ellie's arm with bruising force. The memory came to her unbidden, a night in Vietnam, pulling a young lieutenant from a burning helicopter. That lieutenant had grown into Colonel John Morrison, the man who had once told her, if you ever need anything, Ellie, anything at all, you call me. She hadn't needed to make that call in decades, but as she stared into Havoc's cruel eyes, she knew that was about to change. Calmly, deliberately, she freed her arm and reached into her pocket. You're making a mistake, she said evenly, her fingers hovering over her phone. But you're about to learn a lesson about real respect. And with that, Ellie made the call that would change everything. The phone call was brief. Ellie's words were steady, deliberate, and carried the same calm authority she had once used to guide her crew through enemy fire. On the other end of the line, Colonel John Morrison listened. Though decades had passed since Vietnam, Ellie's voice was as familiar to him as the weight of his own medals. Her message was clear, and it was all he needed to mobilize. By the time Havoc and his gang left the gas station, their bikes roaring down the quiet streets of Clearview, Ellie had already driven away, her heartbeat steady. Havoc might have thought he'd cowed her into submission, but Ellie knew differently. She hadn't survived wars, chaos, and the darkness of combat to be bullied by a pack of pretenders. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. Later that day, Ellie arrived at the Veterans Hall, a simple building with a flagpole in front, where the stars and stripes swayed gently in the wind. Inside, the room buzzed with familiar faces, men and women whose lives were stitched together by shared experiences of service and sacrifice. There was a comfort in their presence, a reminder that even after decades, the bonds of those who served never truly faded. She made her way to her usual seat, nodding to a few friends. Before she could sit, the sound of engines filled the parking lot, not with the chaotic roar of the Thunder Riders, but with the synchronized rumble of discipline. The room fell silent as everyone turned toward the windows. One by one, motorcycles rolled into the lot, their riders dismounting with precision. These weren't just bikers. They were men who moved like soldiers, their leather vests adorned with military patches and insignias. At their head was Iron John himself, his silver hair glinting in the afternoon sun as he removed his helmet. His posture was as straight as Ellie's, his presence commanding respect without a single word. As John entered the hall, a broad smile crossed his weathered face when he saw Ellie. Captain Foster, he greeted, his voice warm yet carrying the weight of their shared history. It's been too long. Ellie stood, returning the smile. Not long enough for trouble to find us again, Colonel. He chuckled. But the mirth didn't reach his eyes. I heard what happened. Seems we've got some boys who think fear is the same as respect. The room buzzed with murmurs as the other veterans absorbed the situation. Clearview wasn't just Ellie's town, it was their town, too. And the idea of a gang terrorizing it didn't sit well with any of them. John turned to the group, his voice taking on the commanding tone of a leader. We owe Captain Foster more than we can ever repay. But this isn't about just her. It's about protecting what's right. These bikers think they own this town. They don't know who they're dealing with. Ellie raised a hand, quieting the room. "This isn't about revenge," she said firmly. "It's about showing them what real strength looks like. They're not prepared for discipline, unity, or strategy. That's where we have the advantage." The plan came together quickly. The Patriot Riders would establish a presence in Clearview, making it clear to the Thunder Riders that the town wasn't theirs to take. Their strategy wouldn't be about brute force but about precision. About countering chaos with calm resolve. That evening, the streets of Clearview were transformed. Patriot Riders stationed themselves outside businesses, their silent presence a deterrent to anyone with ill intentions. They didn't confront anyone, but their very existence sent a message: Clearview was under their protection now. The Thunder Riders didn't take long to notice. Havoc's temper flared as reports came in from his men. "They think they can muscle us out," he growled, slamming his fist on the table in the back room of the Riders' clubhouse. "We'll show them who's in charge." Havoc's lieutenants exchanged uncertain glances. The Patriot Riders weren't like the gangs they'd dealt with before. They moved with precision, their actions calculated. The Thunder Riders thrived on intimidation. But these men weren't intimidated. Meanwhile, Ellie sat on her porch, the night air cool against her face. The distant rumble of motorcycles was no longer a source of tension but a comfort. A reminder that she wasn't alone in this fight. As the stars began to peek through the dark sky, she thought of the young men and women she'd saved in Vietnam, of the strength they'd shown even in the face of unimaginable fear. Clearview was worth fighting for, not with fists or guns, but with the courage to stand firm and the belief that unity could overcome even the darkest threats. Havoc might have thought he'd started a war, but Ellie knew better. This wasn't a war, it was a lesson. And soon enough, the Thunder Riders would learn it. The next morning dawned bright and clear, but the atmosphere in Clearview was charged with tension. The sight of Patriot Riders stationed outside key businesses sent ripples through the town. Some residents watched nervously from their windows, uncertain of what might happen next. Others stepped outside, emboldened by the presence of disciplined men and women who bore the quiet confidence of those who had seen real battles. At Mason's Hardware, Tom Mason, a wiry man in his 60s, stood behind the counter, his hands trembling as he counted the till. The Thunder Riders had been extorting him for months, demanding protection money under the threat of vandalism or worse. The sight of two Patriot Riders standing silently outside his shop brought him a tentative sense of relief. For the first time in months, he didn't have to worry about the sound of motorcycles pulling up. Ellie had spent the early morning checking in on the businesses targeted by the gang. She greeted shop owners with a kind word and reassurances that they were not alone. As she stepped into Diana's diner for her usual coffee, she was greeted by Diana herself, a sturdy woman with a no-nonsense attitude. "You've got the whole town talking," Diana said, setting down a steaming cup of coffee in front of Ellie. "Half of them are scared stiff, and the other half are starting to believe we might actually have a chance." Ellie stirred her coffee thoughtfully. "Fear has a way of making people feel powerless. The Thunder Riders have thrived on that. It's time we showed them what Clearview is capable of." As if on cue, the distant roar of approaching motorcycles cut through the morning calm. Ellie glanced out the diner window, her sharp eyes narrowing as she spotted the familiar insignia of the Thunder Riders. The gang rolled into town, their presence as loud and aggressive as ever. At their head was Havoc, his face twisted in anger. He didn't stop at any of the shops but instead made a direct line for Mason's Hardware. Inside the shop, Tom froze as the sound of engines grew closer. He looked to the Patriot Riders outside, his face pale with uncertainty. One of them, a broad-shouldered man named Mike, gave him a reassuring nod before stepping forward to intercept Havoc. Havoc dismounted, his boots crunching on the gravel as he approached. "What's this?" he sneered, gesturing to Mike and his companion. The old man hired himself some babysitters. Mike didn't flinch. His voice was calm and steady. "This is private property. Mr. Mason isn't interested in your protection anymore." Havoc's laugh was sharp and mocking. Is that right? And who's going to stop me? You. Before Mike could respond, the door to the hardware store opened, and Tom stepped out. His hands trembling slightly but his chin held high. You heard him, Tom said, his voice firmer than he expected. I don't need your protection. The other Thunder Riders watched in silence, their expressions ranging from amusement to unease. Havoc, however, was furious. He stepped closer to Tom, his voice dropping to a threatening growl. You think these guys can protect you forever? They'll leave. And when they do, they're not going anywhere. Tom interrupted, surprising even himself. And neither am I. So why don't you just move along? For a moment, the air seemed to crackle with tension. Havoc's hand twitched toward his jacket, where Ellie knew he likely carried a weapon. But before he could make a move, the sound of more motorcycles filled the air. Patriot riders emerged from around the corner, their presence a silent but unmistakable show of support. Havoc hesitated, his bravado faltering for the first time. He turned his glare to Ellie, who had stepped outside the diner to observe the confrontation. You think you've won something here, old lady, he shouted. This isn't over. Ellie's gaze was steady, unflinching. You're right, she said evenly. It's not over. It's just beginning. Havoc spat on the ground before signaling his men to retreat. The Thunder Riders roared away, leaving behind a town that was starting to believe in its own strength. As the sound of their engines faded, the street fell silent for a moment before a smattering of applause broke out. Tom looked around, his face a mixture of relief and pride. Ellie turned to Mike and the other Patriot riders. Good work. But Havoc's not going to take this lying down. He'll come back. And next time, he'll escalate. Mike nodded grimly. We'll be ready. As Ellie walked back to the diner, she allowed herself a small, fleeting smile. The tide was turning in Clearview. Fear was giving way to courage, and the town was beginning to understand what it meant to stand together. But Ellie knew the battle was far from over. Havoc was a dangerous man, and the next confrontation would be even more challenging. That evening, Clearview's streets were eerily quiet. The sun had set, leaving the town bathed in the soft glow of streetlights. The usual hum of life had dimmed, replaced by a tension that settled heavily over the town. People locked their doors a little earlier, their eyes lingering on the shadows beyond their windows. But not everyone was retreating. At the Veterans Hall, Ellie stood before a map of Clearview spread across a long wooden table. Around her were the leaders of the Patriot Riders, their faces etched with the calm determination of seasoned soldiers. John Morrison stood at her side, his arms crossed as he studied the map. We've got to assume Havoc is planning something bigger, Ellie said, tracing her finger along the streets where the Thunder Riders had been seen patrolling. He's lost his leverage, and men like him don't take that lightly. John nodded. He'll be desperate. Desperate men make dangerous choices. From the corner, Sarah, a Gulf War veteran who had taken charge of intelligence, cleared her throat. We've been monitoring their movements. They've called in reinforcements. We're seeing more bikes coming in from neighboring towns. Ellie didn't flinch. Instead, she leaned over the map, her sharp eyes scanning the marked locations. They're spreading out, trying to control key points around town. They think if they stretch us thin, they'll regain the upper hand. But they're also spreading themselves thin, John added, a hint of a smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. This could work in our favor. Ellie straightened, her voice steady. We don't wait for them to make the next move. We stay ahead of them. We divide their forces, keep them guessing, and remind them that they're not in control. The group nodded in agreement, and soon plans were set into motion. The Patriot Riders would patrol the streets overnight, keeping a watchful eye on the town while gathering more information on the Thunder Riders' movements. They wouldn't engage unless absolutely necessary. This fight wasn't about violence, it was about strategy, discipline, and sending a clear message. By midnight, the Patriot riders were out in force, their bikes humming softly as they moved through Clearview streets. They kept to the edges of the town, observing without being observed, their presence a silent reminder that the town was protected. Ellie stayed at the Veterans Hall, the glow of a single desk lamp illuminating her face as she reviewed reports coming in from the patrols. Her mind was sharp, calculating. She'd been in situations like this before, high stakes, high tension, lives on the line. But this wasn't a jungle in Vietnam. This was her home. Sarah approached, her boots clicking softly against the wooden floor. "We've got movement at the old industrial park," she said, setting down a tablet displaying live surveillance footage. "Looks like they're setting up some kind of base." Ellie leaned in, her eyes narrowing as she studied the grainy images. A dozen bikes, a few trucks, and several shadowy figures moving between the abandoned buildings. "That's their staging ground," she said, more to herself than to Sarah. "They're preparing for something." Sarah nodded. "What's the play?" "We gather more intel," Ellie replied. "If we go in too soon, we risk walking into a trap. But if we wait too long, they could mobilize and hit us hard." As the hours stretched on, Ellie found herself thinking about the town, about the people who called Clearview home. She thought about Tom Mason, who had finally stood up for himself after months of fear. About Diana, who had served free coffee to Patriot riders earlier that evening, her expression filled with determination. About the children who should have been asleep in peace, not with the rumble of bikes haunting their dreams. This was more than just a fight against a gang. It was a fight for the soul of the town, a fight to remind Clearview that fear didn't have to rule their lives. By early morning, the reports coming in grew more urgent. The Thunder Riders were moving. Havoc had split his forces, sending small groups to various parts of town, likely as a distraction. But Ellie wasn't fooled. "He's trying to draw us out," John said, his voice grim as he joined her at the desk. "If we spread ourselves too thin, he'll strike somewhere vulnerable." Ellie's lips pressed into a thin line. "We don't take the bait. We stick to the plan." The plan was simple but bold. They wouldn't engage directly, but they would track every move the Thunder Riders made. They would be patient, disciplined, and deliberate. And when the time was right, they would strike, not with brute force, but with precision. As the first light of dawn broke over Clearview, Ellie stood outside the Veterans Hall, watching the town come to life. The fight was far from over, but for the first time, she felt the tide shifting. Clearview wasn't a town in retreat anymore. It was a town preparing to stand its ground. The dawn was crisp, and the streets of Clearview were unusually quiet, as if the town itself was holding its breath. Ellie Foster stood on her porch, her hands wrapped around a warm mug of coffee. The faint hum of activity from the Patriot Riders' patrols reached her ears, a comforting reminder that Clearview was no longer defenseless. Still, Ellie knew that the most dangerous battles were often fought in silence before the storm. As the morning unfolded, Sarah's call came through, cutting into the calm. "Ellie, we've confirmed movement at the industrial park. Havoc's group is consolidating. They're stockpiling something. I don't think this is just about intimidation anymore." Ellie's brow furrowed as she processed the news. Havoc's tactics had always been built on fear and chaos. But this felt different, calculated. "Stay on them," Ellie instructed. "We need to know exactly what they're planning before we make a move." At the Patriot Riders' makeshift headquarters, the team gathered around a large map of Clearview, plotting their next steps. Iron John stood at Ellie's side, his expression hard but focused. "If they're stockpiling, it means they're preparing for something big," he said. "What do you think their target is?" Ellie's gaze lingered on the map before she pointed to a cluster of buildings near the center of town. "The historic district," she said. "It's not just the heart of Clearview, it's the symbol of everything this town stands for. If Havoc wants to send a message, that's where he'll strike." The room fell silent as the weight of her words sank in. Destroying the historic district wouldn't just be an act of vandalism, it would be an attack on the town's identity. We can't let that happen, John said firmly. We'll set up defensive patrols. Keep eyes on the district around the clock. Ellie nodded but remained thoughtful. It's not just about defense, she said. Havoc thrives on creating fear. If we only react, he's still in control. We need to take the initiative. Her suggestion was met with murmurs of agreement. And soon, plans were being drafted. The Patriot riders would strengthen their surveillance. But they would also use misinformation to lure Havoc into revealing his full hand. It was a strategy born of Ellie's years in Vietnam, where misdirection often meant the difference between life and death. Meanwhile, Havoc was pacing inside the Thunder Riders' makeshift base at the industrial park. The dim lighting cast long shadows on the walls, and his men watched him with a mix of apprehension and loyalty. In the corner, crates were stacked high, supplies the gang had acquired through questionable means. They think they've won, Havoc growled, his voice filled with venom. They think they can run us out of our own town. One of his lieutenants, a younger man named Snake, stepped forward hesitantly. What's the plan, boss? The riders are getting restless. Some of them are talking about cutting out. Havoc turned on him, his face a mask of fury. The plan? The plan is we remind this town who's in charge. They want to protect their precious little shops and streets. Fine. Let's see how they feel when we take everything from them. His words carried an edge of desperation, and even his most loyal followers exchanged uneasy glances. Havoc was doubling down, but his rage blinded him to the fact that his once tight grip on the gang was slipping. Back in town, Ellie moved through the streets, stopping to speak with shop owners and residents. Her presence was both reassuring and inspiring. She reminded them that the fight wasn't just hers or the Patriot Riders, it was theirs as a community. At Mason's Hardware, Tom greeted Ellie with a tentative smile. I never thought I'd feel safe enough to open the shop on a day like this, he admitted. But with you and the Riders here, it's different. We're different. Ellie nodded, placing a steady hand on his shoulder. We've come a long way, Tom. But the hardest part is still ahead. You just keep holding that line. By late afternoon, reports began pouring in. The Thunder Riders were mobilizing, their movements more coordinated than before. Sarah's voice crackled through the radio. Ellie, they're splitting into smaller groups, heading toward multiple targets. They're trying to confuse us. Ellie's mind worked quickly, piecing together the puzzle. It's a distraction, she said. They want to draw us away from the historic district. Iron John, who had been monitoring the chatter, looked up sharply. If that's true, we need to move fast. If we spread ourselves too thin, they'll hit their real target while we're busy chasing shadows. Ellie's lips tightened into a grim line. That's exactly what they're counting on. But we're not playing their game. Let them think they're pulling the strings. We'll be ready when they make their move. As the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows over Clearview, Ellie prepared for the inevitable confrontation. The fight wasn't just about protecting buildings or streets, it was about preserving the spirit of the town. Havoc thought he could extinguish that spirit with fear and destruction. But Ellie knew better. Clearview had already faced its darkest moments. Now, it was time to show Havoc what true resilience looked like. As the last traces of daylight disappeared, the atmosphere in Clearview grew heavy with anticipation. The quiet was deceptive, masking the undercurrent of tension that had gripped the town since the Thunder Riders began their reign of intimidation. Ellie Foster stood on the steps of the Veterans Hall, her sharp eyes scanning the darkened streets. Tonight would be decisive, she could feel it. The Patriot Riders were already stationed strategically around the town, their bikes parked in shadows and alleyways, their presence unseen but deeply felt. Ellie had made sure of that. Havoc's gang might rely on chaos, but the Riders thrived on precision. Each patrol knew its position, each member ready to act without hesitation. This wasn't just about reacting to a threat, it was about reclaiming control of the narrative Havoc had tried to twist. Inside the hall, Sarah was monitoring the feeds from the surveillance cameras they had discreetly installed over the past weeks. The glow from her laptop illuminated her face as she studied the movement of the Thunder Riders. "They're splitting into 4 groups," she said, her voice steady but urgent. "Looks like one group's heading toward the industrial park, another toward the school, and a third toward the old train station." Ellie frowned. "And the fourth?" Sarah zoomed in on the camera feeds, her fingers moving quickly over the keyboard. "Heading straight for the historic district." Ellie's jaw tightened. "It's a diversion," she said, her voice firm. "They're trying to stretch us thin, force us to split our resources." Iron John entered the room, his tall frame filling the doorway. "What's the call, Ellie? Do we spread out? Or do we consolidate?" Ellie didn't hesitate. "We focus on the historic district. That's where Havoc will be. The rest are decoys." John nodded, his respect for her judgment evident. "Understood. I'll redirect the teams." As the orders went out, Ellie stepped outside, the cool night air sharp against her skin. She thought about the historic district, not just the buildings but what they represented. The town's history, its legacy, and its resilience were all encapsulated in those streets. Havoc wasn't just attacking a location, he was attacking the heart of Clearview. The first sign of movement came an hour later. The low rumble of engines echoed through the still night, growing louder as Havoc's group approached. Ellie stood at the corner of Main Street, her hands in the pockets of her coat, waiting. She wasn't armed, she didn't need to be. Her weapon was the community that had rallied behind her. The Patriot Riders who now stood guard at every vulnerable point in the district. Havoc arrived in the center of the district, his gang fanning out behind him like a pack of wolves. He dismounted his bike with the swagger of a man used to getting his way. But tonight, there was a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes as he noticed the quiet confidence of the Patriot Riders stationed around him. Ellie stepped forward, her movements deliberate and unhurried. "You've brought this on yourself, Havoc," she said, her voice steady and unwavering. "You've tried to rule this town with fear. But you've failed." Havoc's face twisted into a sneer. "You think you've won because you've got a few old men on bikes standing around? This isn't over." "No, it's not," Ellie replied, her tone firm. "But tonight, it ends on our terms." Havoc laughed, the sound sharp and mocking, but it didn't carry the same weight it once did. "You've got guts, old lady. I'll give you that. But guts won't save you when this town burns." Ellie took another step closer, her gaze locking with his. "Burn it. And what do you have left? You think your power comes from destruction? Real power comes from building something worth protecting. And you've built nothing." Behind her, the Patriot Riders began to move, their formation tightening around Havoc and his men. One by one, the townspeople emerged from their homes and businesses, standing on porches and sidewalks, their presence a silent but powerful statement of defiance. Havoc's bravado faltered as he realized the full extent of the resistance he faced. This wasn't just a group of bikers, it was an entire town standing together, refusing to bow to his threats. "You've lost, Havoc," Ellie said, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "Leave now, and this ends without bloodshed. Stay, and you'll learn what real strength looks like." For a moment, Havoc seemed to consider his options. Then, with a growl of frustration, he mounted his bike and signaled for his men to follow. "This isn't over," he shouted as he sped away into the night. Ellie watched them go, her expression calm but resolute. "No," she murmured to herself. "It's just beginning." The historic district was safe for now. But Ellie knew Havoc's retreat wasn't a victory. It was a delay. And the fight for Clearview's soul was far from over. The Thunder Riders' retreat from the historic district was only a temporary reprieve. Ellie Foster knew that Havoc wasn't the type to give up easily. His pride had been wounded. his control over Clearview slipping further with every passing day. That kind of desperation could lead to recklessness. And reckless men were the most dangerous. As dawn broke over Clearview, Ellie gathered her core team at the Veterans Hall. The air inside was thick with tension and quiet determination. Iron John stood beside the map of the town, his fingers tracing the routes the Thunder Riders had taken the night before. Sarah monitored live camera feeds, her brow furrowed as she pieced together Havoc's next move. "We've got intel from one of the new patrols," Sarah said, glancing up from her screen. "Havoc's regrouped at the industrial park. But he's not alone this time." "What do you mean?" "Not alone?" John asked, leaning closer. Sarah tapped her tablet, bringing up grainy footage of the industrial park. "We're seeing new vehicles. Trucks. SUVs. These aren't Thunder Riders. They're professionals, mercenaries." Havoc's called in reinforcements. A murmur spread through the room as the implications sank in. Mercenaries meant higher stakes. This wasn't just about local intimidation anymore. Havoc was escalating, bringing in outsiders who had no ties to Clearview and no reason to hold back. Ellie remained calm, though her mind raced. If he's brought in professionals, it means he's planning something big. "We need to figure out what." Sarah nodded. "We've also picked up chatter about shipments moving through town. Could be weapons. Could be explosives. Whatever it is, it's not good." Ellie stepped forward, her voice steady. "Then we don't wait for them to make the first move. We gather as much intel as we can, document everything, and prepare to intercept. If Havoc wants to escalate, we'll be ready." The Patriot Riders mobilized quickly. Their patrols became more frequent, their movements more coordinated. They watched every corner of the town, every alleyway, and every road leading in and out of Clearview. The goal wasn't just to protect, it was to anticipate Havoc's next move and cut it off before it could cause harm. Meanwhile, Ellie took to the streets, meeting with residents and business owners. She could see the fear in their eyes, but she could also see something else: hope. The people of Clearview were starting to believe in their own strength, in their ability to stand together against the storm. At Diana's diner, Ellie sat with Tom Mason over a cup of coffee. Tom's hands were steady now, his posture less defensive. "We've been through a lot," he said, stirring his coffee absent-mindedly. "But I think, for the first time, we've got a chance. You've given us that." Ellie shook her head. "You've had the strength all along, Tom. Sometimes it just takes a little push to see it." Their conversation was interrupted by the buzz of Ellie's phone. It was Sarah. "Ellie, we've got confirmation. Havoc's setting up a staging ground at the industrial park. They've got heavy equipment moving in. This isn't just about making a statement anymore. It's about destruction." Ellie's heart sank, but her resolve only hardened. "What's the timeline?" "Hours. Maybe less." Sarah replied. "We've spotted crates, looks like explosives. He's planning to hit the heart of Clearview." Ellie's voice was firm. "We're not going to let that happen." Back at the Veterans Hall, the Patriot Riders prepared for their most critical mission yet. Ellie and Iron John laid out the plan, their combined experience creating a strategy that balanced precision with caution. "We're not going in to fight," Ellie reminded them. "We're going in to neutralize the threat. Every move we make has to protect the people of this town." As night fell, the riders moved into position. Ellie remained calm, but the weight of the moment pressed heavily on her. Clearview's future rested on what happened next. Havoc thought he could destroy the town to prove his power. But Ellie knew better. True power didn't come from fear or destruction, it came from unity. From people standing together against the darkness. The final confrontation was approaching, and Ellie Foster was ready to face it head-on. The night was thick with tension, the kind that seemed to slow time itself. From their positions around the industrial park, the Patriot Riders watched as Havoc and his mercenaries moved with an unsettling purpose. Floodlights illuminated the area, revealing crates of equipment being unloaded from trucks. It was clear now, Havoc wasn't just trying to make a statement. He was planning to devastate Clearview. Ellie Foster stood with Iron John and Sarah, her calm demeanor masking the weight of the decisions she had to make. They were stationed in an abandoned warehouse a block away, using surveillance feeds and spotters to monitor every move at the industrial park. Sarah tapped her tablet, pulling up another live feed. "They've secured the perimeter," Sarah reported. "Sniper nests on the roofs. Guards patrolling every entry point. They're not leaving anything to chance." Ellie nodded, her sharp eyes scanning the screen. "Which means they're committed. Once they move, they'll have no way out." Iron John crossed his arms, his voice low. "We're running out of time. If those explosives leave the industrial park, we lose our chance to stop this without casualties." Ellie turned to him, her voice steady but firm. "We're not letting those explosives leave. But we need to do this the right way." The Patriot Riders weren't a militia, they weren't equipped to take on mercenaries in a direct confrontation. What they did have, however, was strategy and discipline. Ellie's plan was simple: misdirect Havoc's forces, isolate the explosives, and neutralize the threat before it reached the town. As the riders moved into position, Ellie's thoughts drifted briefly to the people of Clearview. She thought of Tom Mason and Diana, of the families who had watched their town teeter on the edge of fear. Havoc wanted to shatter their hope. But Ellie had spent a lifetime rebuilding what others tried to destroy. She wasn't going to let him win. The first move came just past midnight. A small team of riders created a diversion on the park's south side, setting off harmless but loud distractions that drew several guards away from their posts. Havoc's voice barked through the mercenaries' radios, his frustration evident as he ordered reinforcements to the area. From her vantage point, Ellie watched the chaos unfold. "He's overextending," she said to John. "He's trying to hold too many points at once." John smiled grimly. "He's falling into the trap." While Havoc's forces scrambled to respond to the diversion, another team of riders slipped into the industrial park from the north. Moving quietly and methodically, they identified the truck carrying the explosives and marked it for removal. Their goal wasn't confrontation, it was precision. Neutralize the threat, not escalate the fight. Inside the park, Havoc was pacing furiously, his eyes darting between the trucks and the chaos outside. He knew he was losing control, and the realization only fueled his anger. "Find them," he shouted, slamming his fist against the side of a crate. "I want every last one of them taken down." But the riders moved too quickly and too carefully for his forces to respond. Within minutes, the explosives truck had been quietly disabled, its ignition sabotaged and its payload secured by two of the Patriot riders. Ellie's voice came through their earpieces, calm but commanding. "Pull out. We've got what we came for." As the riders began their retreat, Havoc realized too late what had happened. He stormed out of the central building, his eyes blazing with fury as he watched the last of the Patriot riders disappear into the shadows. "This isn't over," he bellowed into the night, his voice echoing across the empty park. From her position, Ellie watched him, her expression unreadable. "No," she murmured to herself. "But it's over for you." Back at the Veterans Hall, the truck was dismantled under the careful supervision of local law enforcement and federal agents, who had been quietly brought in during the operation. The explosives were secured, and the evidence gathered at the industrial park would later tie Havoc and his mercenaries to a string of crimes far beyond Clearview. As the first light of dawn began to break, Ellie stood on the steps of the hall, watching the town come alive once again. The fight for Clearview wasn't just about defeating Havoc, it was about proving that fear could never triumph over unity. Iron John joined her, his voice filled with quiet pride. "We did it. Ellie. The town's safe." Ellie nodded, a small smile playing at her lips. "For now. But this was never just about safety. It's about showing people what's possible when they stand together." Across the street, Tom Mason opened the doors to his hardware store, greeting the first customers of the day. Diana's diner was already bustling, the smell of coffee and pancakes wafting into the air. Clearview wasn't just safe, it was thriving. As Ellie turned to head back inside, she allowed herself a moment to reflect. The town had faced its darkest hour, but they had emerged stronger. Havoc's reign of fear had ended, and in its place, hope had taken root. And for Ellie Foster, that was victory enough. The battle for Clearview had come to an end, but its story would live on in the hearts of everyone who had stood together to protect their town. Ellie Foster, the 90-year-old veteran who had sparked the movement, watched from her porch as Clearview buzzed with life. Children played in the streets, businesses thrived, and the sound of motorcycles no longer brought fear but a sense of community. The Thunder Riders had been dismantled, their reign of terror replaced by a unity that Havoc could never have understood. Former gang members found new purpose through mentorship programs led by the Patriot Riders, and Clearview became a beacon of resilience and hope for nearby towns. Ellie knew that the fight wasn't just about defeating an enemy, it was about teaching a lesson, that true strength comes from unity, courage, and compassion. Havoc had tried to destroy Clearview, but in the process, he had unintentionally revealed its greatest strength, the unwavering spirit of its people. As the sun set over Clearview, Ellie sat with a cup of tea, her thoughts drifting to the many lives she had touched and the lessons she had learned. This wasn't just her story, it was the story of a town that refused to give up. A town that had found its voice and its strength. Thank you for watching Life Stories. If this tale of courage and resilience inspired you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more incredible stories like this one. See you next time.